Hi and welcome. You are listening to Listen and Relax. Sit back and enjoy these online dating stories. If you want us to continue making these videos, please let us know in the comments what you think about the stories and if we should continue. Please like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay updated when we post new exciting stories. These dating stories are all based on true stories. Thank you for listening. Mickey. It was the summer of 1999, and the internet was a luxury. Expensive, slow, and not something you could use whenever you wanted. I was 12 or 13, and at home, there was only one computer. With five siblings, getting a turn online was like winning the lottery. Most of the time, we argued over whose turn it was, with everyone crowding around, impatient to get a glimpse of the digital world. But there was a solution, one I discovered by accident. The library, just a short walk away, had computers with internet access. For a small fee, I could log in and chat with strangers from all over the world. It was a whole new universe, a far cry from the dusty old bookshelves. So every evening after dinner, I'd grab a few coins and rush to the library. I'd sit at one of the old clunky computers, feeling the excitement bubble up in my chest. I wasn't just browsing or checking emails. No, I was doing something much cooler. I was chatting with people I didn't know. In those days, everyone used chat rooms. Every TV channel, every radio station, it had its own chat room. And each person had one favorite, a digital hideout where they could meet strangers, talk, and share parts of their lives without ever revealing too much. We didn't have photos, usernames were all we had. And if you wanted to get to know someone better, you could ask for their ASL, age, sex, location. I remember the first time I saw it, Mickey. His username appeared in the chat room, and my heart skipped a beat. He wasn't anyone special, not in the way we think of celebrities, but to me, he was. Every evening, I'd look forward to seeing if Mickey was online. When his name popped up, it was like the room suddenly lit up and a little thrill ran through me. We'd talk about everything, our favorite TV shows, our hobbies, the little details that made up our lives. Chatting wasn't as smooth as it is today. There were no emojis, no quick replies. It was all slow typing, clunky and awkward. But I didn't care. Just hearing the little ding of his messages made my heart race. And like any young girl who'd never had much attention from boys, I found myself developing a huge crush on him. He made me feel noticed, special even. To him, I was just another username, but to me, he was everything. Months went by. Our conversations became more frequent, a daily ritual, almost. Then one day, Mickey asked me something I'd never expected. What's your ASL? It had taken us this long to ask. Surprising, really, considering we were both so curious about the other. I hesitated for a moment, then typed it in. 12, female, my city. There was a long pause. A long pause. I waited, staring at the screen, biting my lip in anticipation. I didn't think much of it, but the response that came was anything but what I expected. You're what? 12. You're just a kid. What the hell are you doing online at this hour? Are you trying to be a loser? His words came in a furious barrage of typing. You should be watching cartoons, not chatting with grown-ups. You're nothing but a child. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, the words burning into my mind, but the worst part was the realization that I felt betrayed, exposed in a way I couldn't explain. My heart shattered, my pulse raced, and all I could do was sit there, in silence, as the cruel words scrolled across the screen. I was crushed. Why? I thought. What happened? For hours, I couldn't stop thinking about it. He had always been kind, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in me, until the moment he learned I was only 12. The next day, I logged in again, but I couldn't find him. Mickey was gone. His username wasn't anywhere in the chat room. Maybe he had blocked me, maybe he just didn't care. But for me, it was the end of something I hadn't even realized had meant so much to me. It wasn't just about the boy. It was the first time I'd ever felt the sharp sting of rejection. I had put myself out there, and he had torn me down. I realized then that not everyone online was there to be your friend, and not every connection was as innocent as it seemed. I never went back to that chat room. The thrill of the digital world turned into a reminder of my first heartbreak. I think, in a way, that was the moment I started to understand that not everyone online was who they seemed to be. Mickey, whoever he was, taught me that lesson the hard way. The Great Heist. When Jake asked me out on a Friday night, I thought it'd be a fun, laid back evening. Drinks, laughter, maybe a little dancing. It was our third date, and so far everything about him had been perfect. He was charming, funny, and had this way of looking at me that made me feel like the only person in the room. I spent extra time getting ready that evening, curling my hair just right and picking a dress that balanced casual, what I actually tried. When he pulled up outside my place in his battered old station wagon, he waved out the window with that boyish grin of his. "You look amazing," he said as I climbed into the car, the smell of worn leather and faint cologne greeting me. We made small talk as he drove, laughing about work stories and sharing our latest Netflix obsessions. The night had all the makings of a perfect date, until he casually mentioned a detour. "Hey, do you mind if we make a quick stop? My friend needs help moving some stuff. It won't take long." I hesitated. Moving? On a Friday night? But his easy smile disarmed me, and I found myself nodding. "Sure, as long as it's quick." When we arrived at the house, my gut immediately told me something was off. It wasn't just the neighborhood, though the overgrown yards and dimly lit streets certainly didn't help. The house itself looked abandoned. The paint was peeling, the windows were dark, and the porch sagged like it hadn't seen maintenance in decades. "This is your friend's place?" I asked, stepping out of the car. "Yeah," Jake said, already heading for the front door. "He's been busy and asked me to grab some stuff for him." The door was unlocked, which struck me as odd, but Jake walked in like he owned the place. I followed reluctantly, the sound of my heels on the creaky wooden floor echoing in the empty space. Inside, the house was eerily bare. A few dusty pieces of furniture sat in the corners, and the air smelled stale, like it hadn't been lived in for a long time. There were boxes scattered around, but they weren't the kind you'd use for moving. They were mismatched, old, and covered in grime. "Jake," I started. "Are you sure this is?" Yeah, he cut me off, already rifling through a cabinet in the corner. He said to grab whatever looks valuable. Family heirlooms and stuff. I froze. "Valuable? What do you mean, valuable? Where is your friend?" He didn't even look at me as he pulled out a tarnished silver vase and set it on a nearby table. "Busy." He said to just take care of it. Something in his tone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This wasn't right. None of this was right. "Jake," I said firmly, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay calm. "Whose house is this?" He finally looked at me, his face a mix of irritation and amusement. "Relax, it's fine. The place is empty. No one's going to care." The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't a favor for a friend. This was theft. "You're robbing this house?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Jake rolled his eyes, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "It's not like that. It's just repurposing. Stuff like this shouldn't go to waste." "Are you kidding me?" I stepped back, my heart pounding. "You brought me here to help you steal?" He sighed, setting down an old lamp he'd been inspecting. "Don't be so dramatic. Just wait in the car if it bothers you that much." That was my chance. I nodded, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Okay, I'll wait in the car." I turned and walked out of the house, my legs trembling with each step. Once outside, I fumbled for my phone in my bag, my hands shaking as I dialed my best friend. "Where are you?" she asked immediately, sensing the panic in my voice. I don't know. He's stealing stuff. He brought me to some random house, and he's robbing it." I whispered, glancing back at the house. Jake hadn't followed me out. "Call the police," she said firmly. I hesitated. Calling the cops on my date felt extreme, but what else could I do? My fingers hovered over the dial pad, and then I heard it, the sound of sirens. I hadn't called them, but someone else must have. The blue and red lights flashed in the distance, growing brighter as the police cars pulled onto the street. Jake burst out of the house, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. When he saw the cops, his face went pale. He turned to me, anger flashing in his eyes. "Did you call them?" I shook my head, too stunned to respond. "Hands up one of the officers shouted, stepping out of his car with his gun drawn. Jake dropped the bag and raised his hands, his expression shifting from anger to something I hadn't seen before, fear. The police cuffed him and began questioning him, while another officer approached me. Are you okay, man? Were you part of this? No, I said quickly. I didn't know what he was doing. He said he was helping a friend move. The officer nodded, his face softening. It's a good thing you didn't stick around. This guy's been on our radar for a while. As they loaded Jake into the squad car, he looked at me one last time. There was no apology in his eyes, only bitterness. I watched as they drove away, the flashing lights disappearing into the night. My hands were still shaking, and my mind raced with 1,000 questions. How had I missed the signs? Was there something I could have done differently? When I finally got home, I sat on my couch in silence, replaying the night over and over in my head. One thing was certain, I wouldn't be dating Jake or anyone like him ever again. The Philosopher's Pause. It was supposed to be a cozy night in. Nick had invited me over to watch The Dark Knight, one of my favorite movies. His text had been simple but endearing. Movie night at my place? I'll grab snacks, you pick the flick. By then, I already knew Nick was different. He wasn't like the other guys I dated. He was thoughtful, intellectual, and just a little awkward in a way that made him endearing. He was studying philosophy, a subject I knew very little about, but admired from a distance. How could I say no to a guy who could quote Nietzsche and make it sound poetic? I showed up at his apartment at 7 p.m. sharp. His place was exactly what I expected. A small bookshelf stuffed with dense paperbacks, a single potted plant barely clinging to life, and a couch that looked like it had been rescued from the curb. Welcome to Cosseton, Nick, he said with a sheepish grin, stepping aside to let me in. He'd set up everything perfectly, popcorn in a big bowl, cans of soda lined up neatly on the coffee table, and a well-worn DVD case of The Dark Knight sitting next to the TV. You ready for some Gotham chaos? He asked, plopping onto the couch. Absolutely, I said, settling him beside him. The opening credits rolled, and for the first 10 minutes, everything was perfect. Until he hit pause. Okay, he said, turning to me. The scene. Do you get why it's so important? I blinked. Ooh, yeah? The Joker's introduction is crucial. It sets the tone for the whole movie. He smiled, clearly thrilled I'd caught that. But instead of letting the movie continue, he launched into a 5-minute monologue about the Joker as a symbol of chaos, tying it back to philosophical concepts like moral relativism and existentialism. At first, I was impressed, but then he did it again, and again. By the time Batman first appeared on screen, Nick had paused the movie at least 5 times to explain something important. Every pause felt like a mini lecture, complete with hand gestures and obscure references to philosophers I'd never heard of. See, this moment, he said, jabbing a finger at the screen, is basically Hobbes' social contract theory in action. Gotham is descending into a state of nature, and Batman represents the Leviathan, trying to restore order. Isn't that fascinating? Sure, I muttered, though my patience was wearing thin. By the halfway mark, I wasn't even watching the movie anymore. I was watching Nick, who seemed completely absorbed in his own analysis. Every time he paused, he'd lean forward, eyes bright with enthusiasm, like he was delivering a TED Talk. And then came the book. As the credits finally rolled, after what felt like an eternity, Nick hopped up and disappeared into his bedroom. He returned holding a thick, battered paperback. You'll love this, he said, handing it to me like it was a treasure. The cover read, Sophie's World, a novel about the history of philosophy. It's about a girl who learns philosophy through letters, he explained. It's brilliant. If you read this, you'll totally understand why I'm studying philosophy. I smiled weakly, accepting the book even though I had no intention of reading it. The night ended with him walking me to my car, chatting about Plato's allegory of the cave and how the Dark Knight tied into it. I nodded along, trying to appear interested, but my brain was fried. When I got home, I tossed Sophie's World onto my nightstand and stared at it for a long time. What started as a movie night had turned into a philosophy seminar, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it. Nick texted me later that night. Had a great time. Hope you liked the movie, and the philosophy lessons, winking face with tongue. I sighed. He was sweet, and his passion was admirable. But next time, if there even was a next time, I'd pick a movie he couldn't turn into a lecture. The Third Wheel Mom. It was our second date, and I was cautiously optimistic about Adam. He was kind, polite, and seemed genuinely interested in me. A rare combination. When he texted asking if I wanted to see a movie that Friday night, I didn't hesitate to say yes. Perfect, he wrote back. I'll pick you up at 7. I spent the day thinking about how nice it would be to relax with some popcorn and a good film. Maybe this date would solidify the spark I thought I felt on our first outing. At exactly 7 p.m., Adam arrived at my place, right on time. His car, an old sedan that smelled faintly of air freshener and leather, was already idling in my driveway. You look amazing, he said as I climbed in. You're not too bad yourself, I joked, taking in his clean, button-up shirt and freshly combed hair. As we pulled out of my street, he turned to me with a sheepish smile. Hey, is it okay if we make a quick stop? My mom needs a ride to grab something to eat. I blinked, confused. Your mom? Yeah, he said casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. She doesn't drive, so I told her we could swing by. It won't take long. I hesitated. It was strange. Sure, but not a deal breaker. Maybe he was just being a good son. Okay, I said, trying to sound unfazed. We drove to his house, a modest one-story home with a neatly trimmed lawn. His mom was already waiting on the porch, purse in hand. She looked to be in her late 50s, with the same kind eyes as Adam and a warm smile. You must be Emily, she said, sliding into the back seat. Adam's told me so much about you. Nice to meet you, I said politely, though inwardly I was already questioning what kind of date this was turning into. I hope you don't mind me tagging along, she continued. I was starving, and Adam said you two were headed out anyway. Oh, no problem, I lied. Adam didn't seem to notice the awkwardness. He chatted with his mom as we drove, and I sat in silence, wondering if this was going to be the new normal. When we arrived at the movie theater, I assumed Adam's mom would grab her food and head back home, leaving us to enjoy our date. But instead, she followed us inside. What are you watching? She asked, peering at the movie posters. The new action movie, Adam said. Oh, I love those, she said enthusiastically. Mind if I join? I stared at her, unsure how to respond. Adam, oblivious as ever, grinned and said, Of course, I'll grab the tickets. As we entered the theater, I tried to convince myself it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe she'd sit a few seats away, and I'd still get some time alone with Adam. But no, she sat right between us. The movie started, and within minutes, she was whispering to Adam. What did he say? I missed that part. Adam leaned over to explain, and I sighed quietly, trying to focus on the screen. But the interruptions didn't stop. Every 10 minutes, she'd lean over, either to ask a question or to comment on the plot. That guy's definitely the villain, she whispered loudly during a pivotal scene. By the time the credits rolled, I was mentally exhausted. Adam seemed completely unfazed, chatting with his mom about her favorite scenes as we left the theater. On the ride home, I barely said a word. Adam's mom sat in the back seat, humming to herself like she'd just had the best night of her life. When we finally pulled into my driveway, Adam turned to me with a smile. I had a great time tonight. Did you? I forced a smile. It was interesting. He didn't seem to catch the sarcasm. Maybe next time we can all grab dinner first. My mom would love that. I nodded, not committing to anything. As I walked to my front door, I heard his mom call out from the car. Nice meeting you, Emily. We should do this again soon. I waved politely, but in my head, I knew there wouldn't be a next time. The director who thought he was the star. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon when I got the message. I was at work, buried in emails and spreadsheets, when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. At first, I thought it might be a wrong number or a spam message, but the text was clear. Hey, this is Richard. I'm a director, and I saw you at that event last week. Would you be interested in going on a date? My heart skipped a beat. Richard was a well-known figure in the film industry, a director whose movies were getting rave reviews and whose name had been cropping up in entertainment news for months. I had seen his work. His films were a mix of drama and suspense. always keeping audiences on the edge of their seats. So when I saw his name pop up on my phone, I couldn't believe it. I hesitated for a moment. Was this real? Was I being pranked? But curiosity got the better of me, and I quickly responded, "Sure, I'd love to." We made plans to meet at a trendy restaurant downtown. As the night of the date approached, I found myself feeling both nervous and excited. I mean, this was a guy who had the kind of success most people dream of. But then again, I wasn't sure what to expect. Would he be arrogant and full of himself? Or would he be down to earth and easy to talk to? When I arrived at the restaurant, I was greeted by a host who led me to a private corner table. Richard was already there, sitting with a glass of wine in front of him. He looked just as I expected, sharp, well-dressed, and exuding that confident, I'm in control energy. He stood up to greet me and gave me a warm, yet slightly intense, handshake. "Thanks for coming," he said, his eyes scanning me with an almost unnerving focus. "I've heard great things about you." "Thanks for inviting me," I replied, trying to keep the conversation light. "I've heard a lot about you too." We sat down, and I could feel the tension in the air as he ordered a bottle of wine. He was charismatic for sure, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something a bit too self-assured. He kept talking about his films, his career, how he was always surrounded by people who wanted something from him. At first, I didn't mind it. I mean, he was a director. Of course, he was going to talk about his work. But then, the conversation took a strange turn. "So, let's say we have dinner tonight," Richard began, leaning forward slightly, his eyes intense. "And after dinner, we go back to my place. We get intimate. Do you think that's something we'd both be okay with?" I was caught off guard. I stared at him, unsure how to respond. It wasn't just the bluntness of the question that threw me off. It was the way he said it, like he was running through a scene in one of his films. His tone was matter of fact, as if the idea of sleeping together wasn't even up for discussion, but rather just an inevitable part of the evening. It felt scripted, almost rehearsed. I'm not sure," I stammered, trying to gather my thoughts. "I think we should take things one step at a time, don't you?" Richard didn't seem put off by my hesitation. Instead, he smiled knowingly and nodded. Of course, of course. I'm just saying you never know how these things go, right? Sometimes the chemistry is undeniable." He took a sip of his wine, his eyes never leaving mine. I was uncomfortable, but I tried to play it cool. We continued talking, but the whole time, it felt like I was just another character in his script, like he was already imagining how this night would play out in some cinematic fantasy. I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't a person to him. I was a prop, a plot device. It was as if he was treating our date like one of his movie scenes, carefully constructing every moment. Then, things took another strange turn. "I've been thinking about this for a while," Richard continued, his voice low and serious. "Let's say we were to get serious. I mean, what if we had a child together? You know, just thinking ahead. It's funny, but I've always thought about how I would handle a situation like that. You get someone pregnant, and then you figure it out." I nearly choked on my wine. What was he talking about? We were on one date, and he was already talking about pregnancy and children as though we were in the middle of a long-term relationship. My mind raced to make sense of it. "I think that's a bit premature," I finally managed to say, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Richard just laughed, leaning back in his chair, as though he was pleased with his boldness. Right. It's just that, I'm at a stage in my life where I feel like I could be ready for anything. You never know what life might throw your way." I was stunned. Was he seriously comparing a first date to the kind of conversation you have after years of knowing someone? I couldn't tell if he was trying to make me uncomfortable on purpose, or if this was just how he thought relationships worked. Either way, I wasn't sure I was interested in being part of his what-if scenarios, but somehow I kept sitting there. Maybe it was the intrigue of being with someone so successful. Maybe I thought I could make it through this bizarre evening. But no, I knew by now that this wasn't a date. This was a setup for a movie scene, and I was just a supporting character. After a while, Richard excused himself to use the restroom, leaving me alone at the table. I sat there looking around at the empty restaurant, wondering how I had gotten into this situation. I didn't want to be rude, but I also didn't want to continue this farce of a date. As soon as he returned, I politely excused myself. "It's been great, Richard," I said, standing up, "but I think I'll call it a night. Thanks for dinner." He didn't seem disappointed, just mildly confused. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice a little less confident now. I thought we were getting along so well. I think we're better off as friends, I replied with a smile, hoping to ease the tension. And with that, I left. The guy who got too comfortable too fast. It all started off pretty normal. I worked as a barista in a busy cafe, and there was this regular customer I'd known for a while. Just a guy who came in every morning for his usual order. A double espresso with a splash of oat milk. Always friendly, always with a smile. We started chatting about the usual small talk, the weather, the news, and occasionally about our favorite music or movies. Greg seemed like a nice enough guy. One day, he asked if I wanted to grab a drink sometime. We'd had a few more conversations, and though he was a bit more forward than I expected, he seemed harmless enough. So I agreed. We went to a cozy bar downtown, and the conversation flowed just like it always had, light, casual, easy. That is, until things started to take a strange turn. After a couple of drinks, Greg asked something that completely caught me off guard. So, how would you feel about hanging out with me and my sister sometime? He said with a mischievous grin. I raised an eyebrow, not sure what he meant. What do you mean exactly? Oh, I just thought it might be fun to all hang out together. Get to know each other better. She's really cool, and I thought it'd be a good time, he said, leaning in a bit closer, like he was sharing a secret. The air shifted instantly. My stomach dropped, and I felt a wave of discomfort wash over me. What was he suggesting? This was way too soon, and I wasn't sure how to respond. I don't think that's something I'd be interested in, I said, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. I'm not really looking to get involved in something like that. Greg immediately backpedaled, his face flushing slightly. Wait, no. I didn't mean it like that, really. It's just that we all get along, and I thought it might be fun. No pressure. But the damage was done. The casualness of his suggestion, the way he seemed to think it was no big deal, made me feel uncomfortable in a way I couldn't shake. I wasn't looking for that kind of situation, and I didn't want to stick around to see where else the conversation might go. I think I'm going to head out, I said, standing up from the table. Thanks for the drink, Greg, but I don't think we're quite on the same page. His face fell, and for a moment, I could see the awkwardness settle in. Oh, okay. No hard feelings. I totally get it, he said, though it was clear he didn't fully understand how out of line he'd been. I quickly paid for my drink, excused myself, and left the bar. My mind was racing. I couldn't help but replay the moment over and over. How had this gotten so weird? So fast? I wasn't sure if he truly didn't realize the boundaries he'd crossed, or if he thought he could just joke his way out of it. But either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. The next day, I didn't text him, or the day after that, and I didn't respond to any of his messages. It wasn't just the awkwardness of the date, it was the realization that I hadn't paid enough attention to the little signs along the way. A few weeks later, I ran into Greg at the cafe. When he saw me, he looked a bit uncomfortable. I made a point to avoid eye contact, knowing I wasn't ready to have that conversation again. There was nothing left to say. That night taught me a valuable lesson. Trust your instincts. Some things are just off, and no amount of politeness can make them right. The whole experience left me feeling uneasy and reminded me that you never truly know what someone is thinking, even when they seem like just another friendly face. The girl who was always texting someone else. It was supposed to be a simple date. I met Leah through Tinder. Her profile was full of adventure, pictures of her traveling, hiking, and living life to the fullest. She seemed fun, energetic, and confident, all qualities I admired. We chatted a little, and after a week or so, we decided to meet up for dinner at a cozy restaurant downtown. When I arrived, I was nervous, but I had high hopes. Leah seemed like someone who could keep up with my sense of humor and enjoy the same things I did. She walked in a few minutes after me, looking casual but effortlessly cool. She smiled, and we exchanged the usual pleasantries. It was clear we were both a little shy at first, but I figured that would fade as the night went on. We sat down and started talking. I learned that she loved hiking, photography, and her dog. Nothing too surprising, but we seemed to have a lot in common. The conversation was flowing pretty well, but something felt a little off. About 10 minutes into the dinner, I noticed her phone vibrate. She glanced down, then quickly typed something back. At first, I thought it was just a quick message, something work-related or from a friend. But then it happened again and again. Every few minutes, her phone would vibrate and she would pull it out, her eyes glued to the screen for a few seconds before returning to the conversation. It was starting to feel a bit dismissive. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself that maybe she was just busy. But as the night went on, it became more and more obvious that something was distracting her. I tried to keep the conversation going, talking about my favorite books and movies, hoping to draw her in. But her attention kept drifting. She would nod along, but her focus was clearly on whatever was happening on her phone. At one point, she even giggled at something on the screen, and I couldn't help but feel a little annoyed. Was this a date? Or was I just someone sitting across from her while she scrolled through messages? Who are you texting so much? I asked, half joking, half curious, trying to bring the conversation back to us. She laughed almost a little too quickly. Oh, just a friend, she said, brushing it off. Nothing to worry about. I didn't want to press it. Maybe she was just a little too hooked on her phone. But it happened again. This time, I noticed a name on the screen. Her phone wasn't face down anymore. Mark was the name that flashed across her screen. I tried not to let it get to me, but I couldn't help it. Something about it felt weird. I was right there in front of her, trying to have a conversation. But it was clear her focus was elsewhere. I was getting frustrated, but I didn't want to make a scene. A few more minutes passed, and her phone buzzed again. She checked it and, without even looking at me, said, "Sorry, I really need to take this." She stood up, walked to the bathroom, and left me sitting there alone. I sat there, staring at my untouched food, my mind racing. Who was this guy, Mark? And why was he getting so much attention while I was trying to get to know her? The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. I couldn't help but wonder if I was being too sensitive. But the situation fell off. After what seemed like an eternity, Leah came back. Her face flushed. "Sorry about that," she said, sitting down again. "It was just some stuff I had to clear up." I smiled weakly, trying to brush it off. "No worries. But, I was kind of wondering." I paused, trying to keep my voice light. "You've been texting a lot tonight. Who's Mark?" Her face froze for a split second, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it or change the subject. But then, surprisingly, she said, "Oh, Mark's just a friend from work. He's been going through some things, and I'm just trying to help him out." I nodded, not entirely convinced. "Sounds like a lot of effort for just a friend," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral, though the frustration was creeping in. Leah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you feel ignored. It's just he's going through some tough stuff right now, and I wanted to be there for him. I didn't realize it was coming across like this." I felt a little guilty. Maybe I had overreacted. She seemed sincere, but something about the way she said it made me question her priorities. If she was that concerned about this friend, why did she agree to go on a date with me in the first place? Was she just being polite? Or was she more interested in someone else? The conversation moved on, but the vibe had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was just a placeholder, someone to fill the space until she could get back to whatever was going on with Mark. I didn't want to make a scene, but I knew deep down that this wasn't the kind of date I'd signed up for. When the bill came, I paid my share quickly, feeling awkward about the whole evening. We exchanged pleasantries, but there was no real spark between us anymore. Leah had seemed nice at first, but the whole experience left me feeling more like a second choice than someone she genuinely wanted to spend time with. We said our goodbyes, and I walked out of the restaurant, my mind still buzzing with the unanswered questions. It was clear that she wasn't fully present during our date, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been more invested in her phone than in getting to know me. A few days later, I received a message from her. It was polite, but distant. "Hey, I had a great time the other night. Let's stay in touch." I didn't respond. Something about the way she treated me that night didn't sit right, and I wasn't interested in pursuing it further. It was a shame, because at the start, I thought she was someone worth getting to know. But in the end, it was clear she wasn't as invested as I had hoped. The fishy disaster. It all started with a message that felt like a red flag in hindsight. "I can't wait for you to see my car. She's got personality." I had met Chris on a dating app, and after a few days of chatting, he asked me out for dinner. He seemed nice enough, friendly, funny, and down to earth. A little too obsessed with his car, maybe, but I figured that was just a harmless quirk. When he pulled up to my house, I immediately understood what he meant by personality. His car was unique. The paint was chipped in several places. The bumper was held together with duct tape, and a faint but unmistakable fishy smell wafted out when I opened the door. Sorry about the smell, Chris said as I climbed in. I went fishing last weekend, and I guess it kind of stuck. I forced a smile and tried to breathe through my mouth. It's fine, I lied. The drive to the restaurant was uneventful. At first, we made small talk about work and hobbies, and I tried to focus on his sense of humor rather than the smell that seemed to grow stronger with every passing minute. But then came the parking situation. We pulled into the restaurant's lot, and Chris aimed for a tight space between two cars. He started to back in, but the car lurched forward instead. Oh, right, he muttered. Forgot to tell you, reverse doesn't work. I stared at him. What do you mean, reverse doesn't work? It's no big deal, he said, waving it off. I just have to get creative. Creative turned out to mean parking several blocks away, where he could find a spot he could pull straight out of later. By the time we finally walked into the restaurant, I was already regretting saying yes to the date. Dinner itself was awkward. Chris didn't seem to understand the concept of a two-way conversation. I'd ask him a question, and he'd launch into a 5-minute monologue about himself, completely ignoring any follow-up questions I might have. When I tried to share something about myself, he'd nod distractedly and then steer the conversation back to his latest hobby, building model airplanes. I tried to keep things light, suggesting new topics, but it was like talking to a brick wall. After a while, I gave up and let the silence settle between us. By the time the check came, I was counting down the minutes until I could go home. Chris, however, seemed completely oblivious to my disinterest. This was fun, he said as we walked back to the car. Yeah, I said weakly. The drive home was mercifully quiet, except for the loud clanging sound coming from the engine every time Chris hit the gas. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, willing the ride to be over. When we finally pulled up to my house, Chris turned to me with a hopeful smile. So, when can I see you again? I hesitated, searching for the right words. I think we're looking for different things. His face fell for a moment, but then he nodded. Yeah, I get that. Well, if you ever change your mind, you know where to find me. I smiled politely, thanked him for the evening, and hurried inside. As I closed the door behind me, I let out a long sigh of relief. Later that night, I got a text from him. You forgot to comment on my car's fuzzy dice. They're the best part, winking face with them. I deleted the message and blocked his number. The silent date disaster. I wasn't expecting fireworks, but I thought this date might at least be enjoyable. Sarah and I had matched on a dating site a week earlier. Our chats weren't particularly deep, but they were friendly enough. She seemed laid back, her profile full of quirky humor and photos of her hiking or with her dog. When I arrived at the cafe, she was already seated, her phone clutched in one hand and a coffee in the other. I smiled as I walked up to the table, trying to hide my nerves. Hey, Sarah, right? I said. Yeah, hi, she replied, barely looking up from her phone. I sat down and ordered a drink, brushing off her distracted demeanor. Maybe she was shy, I told myself, or having a bad day. So, I started trying to break the ice. What made you choose this place? It's got a nice vibe. It's close to my apartment, she said, still scrolling through her phone. Right, convenience is key, I said with a chuckle, hoping to get more than a two-word response. Nothing, just more scrolling. Over the next half hour, I asked every question I could think of about her job, her hobbies, even her dog. Her answers were short and disinterested. Oh, you have a golden retriever? I asked, trying to latch onto something she might care about. Yeah, she said, typing a message. He's cute. I tried not to let my frustration show. Meanwhile, she barely glanced at me, her thumbs flying over her screen. I couldn't tell if she was bored or just didn't want to be there. Finally, I took a risk. So, if this is a bad time, we can always reschedule. She looked up for the first time and laughed. No, it's fine. It's just this is kind of awkward, right? I blinked, taken aback. Awkward? Yeah, she said, putting her phone down for a moment. I mean, I can tell this isn't really working. Don't worry, it's not your fault. She might as well have slapped me. Oh, okay. You're nice and all, she added, almost like an afterthought. just not really my type. I bit back the urge to ask why she'd agreed to the date in the first place. Instead, I smiled politely and said, fair enough. We walked back to the station in near silence, the air heavy with unspoken tension. When we arrived, I forced another smile. Thanks for meeting me. Have a good night. Yeah, you too, she said flatly before turning the corner. Out of curiosity, I checked my phone. Sure enough, BAM. She had unmatched me. No message, no explanation, just gone. I wasn't angry that the date hadn't gone well. Rejection happens, and I've had my share of bad matches. What stung was how dismissive and uninterested she'd been from the start. For the first time in years, I seriously questioned why I was still dating. Was this just how people behave now? Was it too much to ask for a little respect? That night, I deleted the app. Maybe for good this time. The boy who believed in demons. It started like any other date. I swiped right, a witty opening line, and suddenly I was sitting across from Evan at a bar downtown. He had that effortlessly cool vibe, messy hair, a crooked smile, and the kind of confidence that seemed completely unbothered by the world. We'd been talking for about an hour when I decided to throw out one of my favorite icebreaker questions. What's the weirdest thing you believe in? It's my go-to question at parties and dates. The answers are usually lighthearted. Aliens, conspiracy theories, celebrity gossip. But Evan's reaction was different. His smile faded, and his posture stiffened ever so slightly. He swirled his drink, avoiding my gaze, before finally looking up. You really want to know? Of course, I said, intrigued. He took a deep breath. When I was a kid, I thought my house was haunted. That's not too weird, I said with a laugh. A lot of kids are scared of ghosts. No, he said, his voice low. It wasn't just ghosts. I thought there were demons. I saw them, crawling on the walls, hiding in the shadows. I used to wake up at night, and they'd be standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. I felt a chill creep up my spine. His tone wasn't joking or playful. It was deadly serious. What do you mean you saw them? I asked cautiously. He hesitated, as if deciding how much to share. Finally, he said, I started seeing them when I was 8. They weren't just in my dreams. They were everywhere. At night, I'd hear whispers, like they were calling my name. I told my parents, but they didn't believe me. I was hooked, hanging onto every word. What happened? Evan leaned back in his chair, staring into the distance. One night, I woke up screaming. I swore there was something in my room, a black shadow, hovering over me. My mom finally took me to a doctor. That's when I found out they'd been giving me Ritalin without telling me. Apparently, it can cause hallucinations in some kids. They thought I was just hyperactive and needed help focusing in school. My jaw dropped. Wait, your parents gave you medication without telling you? Yeah, he said bitterly. I guess they thought they were doing the right thing, but it messed me up. Even after I stopped taking it, I couldn't shake the feeling that the demons were still there. It took me years to convince myself they weren't real. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to comfort him, but another part of me was fascinated. This wasn't the kind of story you heard on a typical first date. So, do you still believe in them? I asked hesitantly. Evan smirked, a hint of his earlier charm returning. No, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I'll hear a creak or see a shadow move, and I wonder, what if? We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his story lingering between us. Then, he broke the tension with a laugh. Sorry, that got dark. Not exactly first date material. Huh? Are you kidding? I said. That's the most interesting answer I've ever gotten to that question. He grinned. So, do I pass the test? I laughed. You definitely pass. Later that night, as I walked home, I couldn't stop thinking about his story. It was unsettling and intriguing, the kind of thing that sticks with you. And yes, I went home with him. The blind date that almost ruined everything. I had been in a steady, long-term relationship for several years when one day, I received an unexpected email from a friend of mine, Sarah. She was always trying to play matchmaker. So when she told me she had a friend who she thought would be perfect for me, I didn't think much of it. She said that we get along well, and that we should meet up for a casual drink. It sounded harmless enough. I assumed she meant a friendly hangout, nothing more. But then, as I was getting ready to leave for the evening, I decided to reread the email. I skimmed through the lines, but something caught my eye that I hadn't noticed before. She hadn't just suggested a friendly drink. No, she had set me up on a blind date. My heart sank. How had I missed that? The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a casual meeting. This was a date. I wasn't sure how to feel about it. I had a boyfriend, someone I was deeply in love with, and I couldn't just pretend to be interested in someone else. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't want to disappoint Sarah. She was one of my closest friends, and if she thought we'd get along, maybe it wouldn't hurt to meet him. We could just have a nice dinner, and I'd make sure to bring up my boyfriend immediately. That way, there would be no misunderstandings. With that decision in mind, I walked out the door, nervously glancing at my phone. I sent a quick message to my boyfriend. Hey, just so you know, I'm going on a blind date tonight. But don't worry, I'm definitely not interested in anyone else. The restaurant we were meeting at was quiet, cozy, and had an intimate atmosphere. I arrived early, hoping to collect my thoughts before he showed up. A few minutes passed, and then I saw him. He walked in, scanning the room until his eyes met mine. He smiled and waved, and I returned a nervous grin. His name was Alex, and I could tell immediately that he was nervous too. Maybe it was the awkward shuffle of his feet or the way he kept adjusting his jacket, but it was clear we were both out of our comfort zones. We exchanged polite greetings and settled into our seats. The waitress brought over the menus, but neither of us seemed to know what to say. I didn't want to come off as rude, but the reality was that I wasn't looking for anything romantic, and I didn't think he was either. It felt like we were both just going through the motions. We had nothing in common and no real connection. I tried to make small talk, mentioning that I had recently moved into a new apartment, and he told me about his job at a marketing agency. We both smiled politely, but it was clear there was no spark. The silence between us grew heavier with each passing minute. Finally, I decided to break the tension. I couldn't just sit there pretending everything was fine. I cleared my throat and said, So, I've been in a relationship for several years now. My boyfriend and I have been together since college. Alex blinked at me, his eyes widening a little. Oh, that's great, he replied, although I could tell his enthusiasm was forced. I didn't realize you were already seeing someone. That makes things a little awkward, doesn't it? I laughed nervously. Yeah, I guess it does. But I think it's important to be upfront about these things, right? He nodded, but we both knew this was the moment the date had essentially ended. The rest of the dinner was filled with awkward silences, punctuated only by the occasional forced comment about the food or the ambience of the restaurant. It felt like we were both just trying to make it to the end of the meal without saying anything too embarrassing. At some point, the waitress came to check if we were ready for dessert. I looked at Alex, who seemed hesitant. He glanced down at his phone for a second before looking up at me again. I think I'm good, he said with a tight smile. I'll pass on dessert. Me too, I replied quickly, eager to end the night. We both stood up and exchanged awkward goodbyes. There was no let's do this again sometime or it was nice to meet you. We both just nodded and parted ways, each of us relieved that the ordeal was finally over. As I walked to my car, I felt a sense of embarrassment wash over me. What had I been thinking? How had I let myself get into that situation? I loved my boyfriend, and I wasn't interested in anyone else. The whole blind date felt like a bizarre mistake, something I never should have agreed to in the first place. And yet, it was done. The worst part was that I wasn't even sure what Sarah thought when I told her how it went. Would she be disappointed? Did she think I'd actually hit it off with this guy? I didn't hear from Alex after that night, and I never saw him again. I can't say I was disappointed. The whole thing felt like a strange chapter in my life that I could now laugh about. But it did make me wonder how often people get swept up in situations they didn't plan for. How often they end up somewhere they didn't expect, only to realize they were never supposed to be there in the first place. The guy with the collages. It was supposed to be just a casual date. We'd met a couple of times at a coffee shop, and things seemed to be going well. Michael was funny, charming, and easy to talk to. He had this laid-back vibe that made me feel comfortable right away. After a few drinks and some good conversation, he invited me to his apartment. We got there, and the first thing I noticed was how tidy everything was, except for his bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. He seemed a little nervous as we entered. Sorry about the mess, he said, a little embarrassed. I didn't expect company. I wasn't sure what to expect, but when I walked into the room, I froze for a second. The walls were covered, no, absolutely covered, with posters and collages. But they weren't the kind of posters you'd expect in someone's bedroom. There were pictures of expensive sports cars and exotic places. Sure, but then there were also a lot of, well, let's just say they were images of women in bathing suits, very revealing bathing suits. It wasn't just one or two images. There were dozens, maybe even hundreds. From the ceiling to the floor, the walls were plastered with these photos. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. Michael noticed my hesitation and quickly added, "Oh, I forgot to take these down." I was in a rush to tidy up. I tried to keep my cool, forcing a smile. "No worries. I didn't know we were in an art gallery." I joked, trying to make light of the situation. But the awkwardness hung in the air like a thick cloud. Michael seemed genuinely embarrassed. "I've been working on a new project, collecting these images. I know it's a bit much, but it's just something I've been doing for fun. I guess I should have cleared it out before, well. I nodded, not really knowing what to say. The posters weren't just a little quirky. They were all over the place, and they made me feel strangely uncomfortable. It was hard not to focus on the fact that every image had a very particular focus, bodies, angles, and poses that felt almost too specific, too focused on one aspect of a person. We sat down on his bed, and I could tell he was trying to ignore the obvious tension in the room. I didn't want to judge him, but the more I looked around, the more I felt like I was in the wrong place. My eyes couldn't help but keep going back to those posters. It wasn't just a matter of taste anymore. It felt like a boundary had been crossed somewhere. "Hey, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," Michael said, clearly picking up on the vibe I was giving off. "I know it's not exactly what you'd expect. It's just, I don't know. They're part of this project I've been doing. I swear, it's not as weird as it looks." I forced another smile, trying to ease the situation. "It's fine, really. I just wasn't expecting all this detail." He seemed relieved that I wasn't making a scene, but my mind was racing. Was this normal for him? Was it something I could overlook? I wasn't sure, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to stick around to find out. After a few moments of awkward silence, I stood up. "Look, Michael, I think I'm going to head out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't expect this kind of, vibe. He looked genuinely disappointed. "Oh, okay. I understand. I didn't mean for it to be weird. I really like you, and I thought we were getting along." "I'm sure you're a great guy," I said, "but I just don't think this is the kind of atmosphere I'm comfortable in." Michael nodded, his face turning a little red. "Yeah, I get it. I really do." I grabbed my things, gave him a quick, awkward hug, and made my way to the door. As I left, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, I felt bad for cutting things short. He seemed like a nice guy, but something about his room just didn't sit right with me. It wasn't even the photos themselves. It was the overwhelming feeling of something off, something that crossed a line without ever saying it out loud. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Was I overreacting? Should I have given him a second chance? But no matter how I looked at it, something felt